everybody. I'm Carolyn Hadlock, and this is the Eunoia Podcast. Eunoia is the Greek word for beautiful thinking, and that's what the show is all about. I interview beautiful thinkers who are creatives, founders, authors, and CEOs, and I try to get inside their heads. Hey, everybody. I'm with Emily Granger, who's a world-renowned harpist, who was born in Kansas, but now resides and works in Sydney, Australia. And in conversation with her today is Luke Tierney, who is a resident Australian and is the founder of Tier 1 Arts, and they represent Emily. So it's so nice to have you guys both on the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you.
All right. So Emily, I would definitely love to start with you and kind of talk about your evolution as an artist. Just sort of take me through, you're from the Midwest, as well as me. We went to the same college. That's crazy to me. But I'd love to hear just your origin story, how you got started. I know it was early, and then to where you are right now.
Yeah, so I grew up in the suburbs of Kansas City, Missouri. Mm-hmm. And, no one in my family was a musician by trade at all, but music has always been a big part of my family. And so I grew up listening to a lot of music with my dad. And my mom actually was quite an amazing singer, and she played piano. And my grandmother also was a pianist and organist and actually played the marimba as well. And at one point had a marimba choir. So I think music was just kind of at the core of my family. So growing up with all of that, but I had no idea what a harp was. I'd never seen a harp in my life, and it wasn't until I was 10 years old that I heard the harp on a CD of Celtic music. And I remember sitting in the living room listening to the CD and asking my mom what in the world was that instrument, because I'd never heard it before. And she told me it was a harp. I just knew, at that moment, I have to be able to do that. There was just something about the sound that really resonated with me and just stuck with me. And so it was a whole year. I begged my parents. And so I showed up for the first day of orchestra in 7th grade with a little Celtic harp. And that was it. I found a lovely teacher in Kansas City. She was a freelance harpist who played, lots of weddings and things like that. And I remember showing up for my very first harp lesson and walking into her home, and her entire first floor was just filled with harps, all of these Celtic harps and all of these big golden pedal harps as well. And I just I remember that lesson so well. I remember the feeling of just sitting down and pulling the harp back on my shoulder and just knowing that I was going to spend the rest of my life dedicated to playing this beautiful instrument. I know it's quite a ridiculous romantic story, but I swear to you, that's how it happened.
It feels like that's how, if a story has a harp in it, it has to be a romantic story, I feel like.
Yeah, right? So then it was challenging. Definitely, I think growing up in the Midwest, classical music is not a big thing, and it definitely wasn't when I was growing up. And it was hard. I got bullied and made fun of for playing the harp because it was so ridiculous. But that just made me bury myself into music even more. And I was lucky to be able to go away to summer camps. And the most influential camp that I went to was Interlochen up in northern Michigan. Mm-hmm. I spent 2 summers up there, and we weren't allowed cell phones or internet access. We lived in cabins, and we just would wake up every morning to the sound of a trumpet calling us, line up outside in the woods of northern Michigan, and then run off to orchestra rehearsal. And then I'd run off to harp ensemble rehearsal. And that was the first time that I was really surrounded by all of these other kids that were just as passionate about music as I was. And that was a huge turning point for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. From there, I went away to uni, and I went to Indiana University, as you did, in Bloomington, which has one of the best music schools in the world. And I got to study with Suzanne McDonald, who is the godmother of harp. She's taught everyone. And I was in a studio of 20 other harp majors, if you can believe it. Up until then, I was kind of I was kind of a big deal in Missouri, you know.
Yeah.
There weren't any other harpists to really compete with. And when I went to Indiana, it was like, oh, I was nobody. You know, I was just another harpist. And there were all of these amazing students that were going around and competing in the biggest international competitions and winning them. And, you know, I was just this girl from Missouri just trying to keep up. And I did. And I took note, you know, and that definitely pushed me and just gave me a good perspective on things and where I needed to be and how hard I had to work to be able to make it in this industry.
Yeah. And then you went to Chicago. Is that right?
I
After that?
did. Yeah, so then I went and I did my master's at the Chicago College of Performing Arts. And I went there because I wanted to study with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra principal harpist, Sarah Bullen. So I was able to like really hone in and focus my skills on trying to become an orchestral harpist. And so I got to work with all of these amazing conductors, and all of my colleagues came from all over the US as well. And it was amazing.
And then how are you in Australia? I'm assuming there's a boy involved.
Of course, there always is, isn't there?
Yep.
So through my studies, I met so many amazing people that I've stayed in touch with. And one of those people was a composer that I met while studying at Indiana. And he was from Sydney. He came up for a conference and asked if he could crash on my couch for a few nights. And he also had another musician with him, this recorder player from Sydney. And they both stayed on my couch for a few nights. And I'd never met her before. We really hit it off playing these ancient instruments that we do, but also having a love for new music, contemporary music, living music. And she said, kind of off the cuff, oh, God, you've got to come down to Australia sometime and we can perform together, you know. And I laughed it off, thinking like, oh, yeah, right. Of course, I'm going to go to Australia, you know, like that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
But it did. And she won this massive award a few years later, and she commissioned 3 new works for harp and recorder. And we got to work closely with those 3 composers, one of which is now my fiance.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so that's how I ended up here. Love and new music.
But playing at the Sydney Opera House, that must have been just a bucket list thing for you.
Yeah, and now that it's like kind of a regular occurrence as well, I have to just pinch myself. Like when I'm walking, you know, I get off the train at Circular Quay and it's just got like the most amazing and iconic view that you can imagine of Sydney, seeing the Harbour Bridge and the harbour and the Opera House, and walking, you know, to go play a concert. I'm just like, where am I? Who am I? How did I get here? Like,
that's amazing. Do you feel like the music scene or even the classical music scene is different there than it is in the Midwest?
Oh, yes and no. I mean, Sydney is a big city for sure.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. But there's also a lot going on in the Midwest as well. And I think, you know, we're, as musicians, like, we're just inherently creative and restless and creating opportunities and making things happen. So I think it's just knowing where to look.
Yeah. And then, so how did you meet Luke?
So last year, I went to the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, which is this amazing campus in Banff, Canada. And you can apply for these artist residencies. And I got accepted to go and spend 5 weeks there in the middle of winter with my own room. And they have a harp and everything. And I was able just to lock myself up in the mountains, which I love, and just practice. So while I was there, I met a musician, a classical guitarist, Andrew Blanche, who is also based in Sydney. And we really hit it off as friends and as colleagues. And it was a really special place because we were all incredibly vulnerable because everyone was working on projects. Nothing was finished. And we're so used to, like, the only thing that people see or hear from me is the final finished, polished product that I'm going to put out there. You know, like I'm not gonna post little practice videos of me trying to work on something
Yeah.
and failing, and that's what we did. Like we had these sessions every week where we sat around in a circle. It was a sharing circle, and we would play for each other, and we'd play works in progress, and then we would talk about it. And it was amazing because it was musicians from all different backgrounds. There were pop singers and electronic musicians, and Andrew and I were actually some of the only like traditional classical musicians.
Oh, interesting.
Working on that kind of repertoire as well. But anyway, we really hit it off and started playing together while we were there, finding all of this repertoire for classical guitar and harp. And in conversations with Andrew, he just started talking about this Luke and telling me all of these great things that Luke was doing for him, his manager. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh God, I need help. Like I need someone in my life to help me. Like it's being a independent classical artist is like, it's a small business, and I'm doing it all by myself. And I've known for a while that I needed help. And when he started to tell me about all of these things that Luke was helping him do, just like, you've got to put me in touch with him, please, And so Luke and I met in January of this year, and I feel like it's just been an incredible relationship, and I am so grateful to have Luke in my life.
Yeah, nice. And then Luke, what did you think when you first heard Emily play?
I think when hearing an artist, there's the playing side of things, which is the obvious thing to go to. What do you hear when you experience a musician? And that is the sounds that they're making. We're in a privileged position, I guess, in classical music, in that those who come through the system make it out to the top end and are working, whether it's with an orchestra or an ensemble or as a freelance musician. The artistry is really superb. So the voice that I'm looking for is the person behind those sounds and the stories that they have to tell. So when I first spoke to Emily, what really came forward is that she was an artist who cared deeply about what she did. She knew what sort of music she wanted to make, who she wanted to make it with, and she had ideas about the steps to get there. And that's what I need as an artist manager, to work with someone that has goals and is willing to put in the work, because it is a lot of work outside of the practice room to build a career.
Would you have ever put her and Andrew together?
Guitar and harp is something I don't think I even knew existed before I'd heard Andrew say he was working with Emily. So yeah, that's definitely something I hadn't come across before.
Our most popular combination would be harp and flute. Not so much harp and classical guitar, but it's amazing. It's been really fun to explore the sound worlds and just come together with our different backgrounds and approaches to music making.
And I would think for you, what are the edges? Because it is one of the oldest instruments. It's 3,000 years old. Do you feel like you have hit the edges of what sound you can get from the harp?
Oh, not at all. I think it's going to be a lifelong journey exploring sound and space. And the beautiful thing about the harp is the resonance, right? You pluck a string and the entire instrument just lights up and resonates, and you can feel it on your body vibrating. And it's this incredible experience getting to play with that, in time and space, and explore different ways of phrasing and different ways of thinking about playing the harp. And so much of it is in the gestures, so the motion after we actually pluck the string. And also just in our mind. And there's so much that goes on. Like, I'm always singing and counting in between the notes that I'm playing to help phrase, because we can't sustain like a violin or a flute and be able to move the sound with us as we go along. Like, once you pluck the string, that's kind of it, but it's where you place the next note and listening to the decay of the sound as well. It's just, it's an incredible thing. So I'm still exploring new colors and approaches, and I think I always will be.
Wow, that's really interesting. Luke, what do you think she means when she says color?
Color is one of the tools that we have to use as musicians. I guess I should go back to a definition of music, and the one that works best for me is music is organized sound. That's the only definition I've ever come across that really can adequately describe what we do. And the way we organize the sound relates to our choices of instruments and notes and form, and color is one of those characteristics we can use. Tone color or timbre are some other words we might use to describe it. So as a guitarist, I can change the color of a note, particularly by where I pluck the string. So if I pluck it at one end of the string, you get a bright metallic sort of sound, and the closer you get to the midpoint of the string in plucking, the more pure, I guess, the sound wave and what we might describe as a sweeter sound. So things like that can have a great impact on, I guess we can use it to structure musical idea, but particularly relating to mood.
Yeah.
It's a great technique to have at our disposal.
Do you play other musical instruments as well, or just the harp?
Oh, look, I think that's my ability. I think there are so many musicians that are able to play many different instruments and do them all quite well, and I'm not. I'm not one of those. I have just focused my life's work to the harp, and I think that's enough.
Have you had multiple harps? Have you had one for a long time? I would imagine it's such an expensive investment. You probably don't have a lot of them.
No, unfortunately, I don't. So the thing is, harps are like cars. You know, once you drive it off the lot, it depreciates in value. It's not like a violin or a cello that, you know, over time they get better and better and better, and also more and more expensive. Harps have 2,000 moving parts in them.
Wow.
And also 2,000 pounds of tension because of the strings. So over time, the harp will warp and the wood will crack and move around. So there is kind of an expiration date on a harp.
But I saw that you take it out. I saw that you took it out to the Blue Mountains National Park. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah. I actually just came back from another residency program out there, and it was amazing. I love being able to be in nature with my harp, especially.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because I know that you've hiked many places all over the world. And just what do you think the correlation is between your love of nature and playing the harp?
Yeah, I think there's a reason that so many composers have written pieces inspired by nature and birdsong. Specific places that they've been in the mountains and forests. I love having space and time to think. My life in the city is hectic and there's so much going on, and it's great, and I love the hustle and the bustle, and I can just jump right in with all of that. But there's something about going away. When I go hiking, you know, I turn off my phone. I don't have cell phone reception. I'm not constantly on social media or having to respond to emails or worry about this or that. And the ability to just go out there and be surrounded by natural beauty and just listen to the sounds around me. And it's amazing what you hear when you get out of the city and you give yourself time to think and listen.
What's the most unique place you've ever taken your harp outside and played?
It would have to be this last trip that I did to the Blue Mountains. I took not my big concert grand harp, but a little Celtic harp onto a cliff overlooking the Blue Mountains National Park. And as you all know, we had quite the devastating bushfires last year, and this particular little village that I was in was incredibly devastated by the fires. And sitting on this cliff, looking out, all you could see were just these burned black trees everywhere. And I was there for 3 weeks, and I did not see one wallaby, one kangaroo, an echidna, all of these beautiful little mammals that you normally go out into the bush and they're everywhere. There's so many little animals around, wombats, things like that. Like it was quite sad, actually. And I just felt the need to go and play for them. I play for the animals that lost their lives and the trees that were trying to regenerate and all of the little insects that are trying to make it in this new landscape that they've found themselves in.
I could talk about this stuff forever because it's just the spirituality is really neat. But, Luke, one of the things you and I have chatted about in the past is the fact that classical music is finding a new audience. And we've talked about, Spotify and students needing to listen to classical music. Maybe Einstein started that. I don't know. But just this idea of having more of a relationship than its previous generations, or a different relationship. And then now, especially with the pandemic, of those streaming classical music in the last year, a third were 18 to 25 years old. So I'm just curious to hear your take, Luke, on why you think that's happening and where you think the opportunity is, and how it relates to the pandemic and social media.
Yeah, the modern playlist movement, I guess I'd call it, is, the next generation of what was radio in the past and what still is radio, but a lot more listeners are moving over to streaming platforms and listening to music through playlists. And for certain tasks, there's nothing more reliable, I guess, than classical music in the ability to maintain a certain mood, and the absence of the voice in a lot of classical music is going to make it easier to have on in the background. So there's a lot of people listening to classical music right now who are using it as background music, and that's great in some ways. It's also difficult for people working in the industry, in that someone that listens to classical music in the background is not necessarily the same person that's going to go out and listen to a specific artist on Spotify, or even more important, go out and see a concert by a classical musician. So that's one of the challenges we're facing with rising audiences, but perhaps not the sort of audience that is going to support careers.
And I know you and Emily in particular have been doing a lot of kind of interesting things with social media, and, obviously on this hiatus to help your artists and raise their profile with presenters, because that's kind of like, as you just said, that's where the future is of supporting artists in their careers. But now with this sort of new paradigm, how do you think, you guys using social media is going to change that coming back? Because now you're really focusing on creating an audience, a connection with the audience that you can then take back to the presenter. So it's kind of flipped on you, but are you seeing any new opportunities inside of that space?
Yeah, absolutely. With a streaming platform, there's not really the chance for classical musicians to build relationships with audiences. So people can go to Spotify and hear a song and connect with the story of that song. With classical music, instrumental classical music, people can only connect with, I guess, a mood or an interpretation, depending on their level of experience with the music. But in social media, we can reach out to people that we would have no way of getting in front of otherwise, not on that scale, and not just present them music, but also show them ourselves, how we look as we perform. And if connections are made beyond that, through text, whether written or spoken, we can be communicating with audiences, telling them more about us, and in their responses, getting to know more about them. Just going back to that guitar and harp music we were talking about earlier, there was a lot of great feedback on that music, and people hadn't heard that combination before, and yet they really enjoyed that. So that's great feedback to have. And we would have had none of that over this period if we hadn't reached out to people through social media.
And then, Emily, you are a star on social media. You're so good, and you are gracious and generous, and you seem to genuinely enjoy connecting. But how has it been for you not being able to play on a stage for the past 7 months?
I think I've definitely used social media as my outlet. Like, I love performing so much. I love being on stage and sharing my music with people. And because I haven't been able to do that, Luke and I have been able to move things around and change how I do that in the traditional sense and reformat that to make it work through social media. So we've been creating and recording all of these new videos that I've been able to share and put out there. And it's been really fun. And at first it was kind of terrifying because I hadn't really done that much in terms of making music videos, and it is different than playing a concert because it's like, oh, people are just getting a really close look at my face and my hands and exactly what I'm doing,
That's a whole different level of performance. I can appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's going to be out there on the internet forever.
Yeah. But now your parents can see you play.
Yes. Yeah, they love that.
And I think, I'm in marketing, and a lot of innovation right now is happening in the arts, specifically in music. And Luke, you and I have talked about this at length, but it's just really cool to see this new sort of breed of intimacy. What do you guys think is the most misunderstood concept about classical music?
I think in terms of the work that we're doing, the most common misunderstanding is that classical music is a music that involves some distance from performers. I mean, historically, audiences don't have access to performers, and they're used to seeing someone up on a stage. They'll enjoy the performance, they'll applaud at the end, say that was great, but they don't expect to have a connection with that artist beyond that performance. Particularly in the orchestral setting, the orchestras will bring through major international artists season after season, and they'll enjoy that. But they're not connecting with performers in the long term, besides that base of the orchestra. And I think a lot of enjoyment in music, in art, comes from knowing the people who are creating the art, understanding why they make the art like they do. And it's possible for people to have that relationship with performers. It's just that there aren't a lot of classical musicians that are doing that right now. And that's what we're trying to do, to build connections with audiences so that they know us, we know them, and there's great benefits to both sides from that.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to hear, and I'm sure, Emily, when you sit down with a piece that has been around for, if it's Mozart or Bach or somebody, it's probably really interesting to think about what your take is on that piece, and then, what you bring to it and how you play it. So, what's your favorite thing to play right now?
Right now, I'm playing this beautiful work by an Australian composer, Ross Edwards. It's called The Harp and the Moon. And it's this incredible solo piece that I've spent the better part of a year working on. Of course, many people have played it before me, but for whatever reason, it kind of just feels like it's my own, and I can do whatever I want with it musically. And I've spent so much time changing my interpretation and just trying things out, and it's just been a really fun project, and it's my favorite thing to play at the moment.
It's fascinating to think about taking a year and taking that amount of time to really fine-tune how you think about it and how you want to express it and how you want to play it. Is there anything unique about your creative process?
Yeah, I definitely listen to a lot of recordings. I've had teachers back in the day tell me, oh, no, you can't listen to a recording of this piece. I want you to come up with your own interpretation. And I think that that's absolute crap. I think you can listen to as many recordings as you want to get ideas, and try your own ideas out. And yeah, I love listening to great musicians, and I love hearing what they do. And then I just at some point have to let all of that go and just make music. It's been a journey of mine, I think, especially as a young woman, feeling comfortable and confident with my own voice and being able to say, yes, I do have a voice and I can do what I like with this. I am an interpreter of this music. And, it's not always going to work, but most of the time it works.
Yeah. Luke, for you, for Tier 1, you represent several artists. What is the common connection between them? I know they all play different instruments.
Yeah, there's one thing that came about, I guess, through my relationships is a strong connection to contemporary music or music of living composers. And that comes from my own background as a guitarist and composer with a strong interest in that music. So a lot of the people I've connected with through the decades in the industry have been people working in that space, and it's an area that I'm passionate about. So when I was putting together the roster, I was naturally inclining towards those sorts of artists.
Yeah. Well, as Luke knows, I do always ask this question, and I will ask both of you guys. The blog is Eunoia, which means beautiful thinking in Greek. And so I'm always interested to hear how people would define beautiful thinking. So maybe, Emily, I'll start with you, and then I'll end with you, Luke, if that's all right.
I think beautiful thinking is the ability to actually transcend thinking. Finding that space where you're riding above thought and actually able to exist on this whole other plane.
Yeah, awesome. Beat that, Luke.
It's a tricky one because we've both come from a similar background as performing musicians, and a large part of the training of the musician is this idea of mastery, and you practice hours and hours a day, day after day, year after year. And what you're aiming for is, in this case, a control of the physical to the point where you can follow where your intellect takes you. But then as you get better and better, the intellect can sort of switch off. It assesses what you do, but then you get out of the way and follow what you've built into your muscle memory, your creative memory, I guess. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's creative. The flow state is where beautiful thinking happens in music and in much of life. It's being able to step aside and bring together new information and respond to it in the instant in a way that is perhaps unique to you or even the time and place that you're in.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you guys for sharing the last hour with me, and I think you're creating a balm for a lot of people, and I really look forward to following your career, Emily, and I thank you guys for taking the time today.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you, Carolyn.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did, and I hope you took something from it. Something that'll help you with your next meeting, next pitch, your next big project. But above all, I hope it inspires you to think strange, different, new, and beautiful thoughts. For more from this interview and other chats with beautiful thinkers, visit carolynhadlock.com to subscribe on Medium and follow @Eunoia Quarterly on Instagram. That's EUNOIA Quarterly.